Hey everybody, how's it going? Welcome back to the channel. It's me, Rocco, again. Thanks for coming back. And today we're going to be doing an album review, talking about one of my favorite bands of all time. Yes, one of the progressive rock giants from the early 70s, mostly dabbling in symphonic progressive rock. Really one of the big bands, one of the most influential bands in my life. And I would definitely say these guys have to be somewhere in my top 5 favorite bands of all time. Right up there with Genesis, right up there with Zeppelin, Rush, Sabbath, and Pink Floyd as well. I think that's 6. So maybe they're in the top 6, but who knows? And yeah, they've always been one of my favorite bands. I believe the first album review I ever made way back in 2012 was actually of Close to the Edge, which remains one of my all-time favorite albums, if not my favorite. And since then, I haven't really touched on these guys. So I'm going to consider this my first, proper review of Yes, and there's going to be many to follow. And I decided to go with their most controversial album, Tales from Topographic Oceans. And the reason I chose this album, well, there's 2 reasons. First of all, my last video was Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath by Black Sabbath. And Yes actually tied into the history of that band because both albums were being recorded at the same time, and they actually grabbed Rick Wakeman from Yes to play a few piano sections on that Sabbath album, and it inspired me to go back, listen to the album, and it just refreshed my memory of how much of a fantastic album this is. And I know that's controversial. I know a lot of people hate this album, but to me, even though it has flaws, I'm not going to pretend this album's perfect like Close to the Edge. It does have flaws, but overall, I still think it's a fantastic progressive rock album and keeps Yes's fantastic streak of amazing albums alive. I mean, starting with the Yes album all the way up to Going for the One, I gotta say, those 6 albums there are some of the strongest in progressive rock history, and you just can't deny the quality of those albums. I mean, straight up masterpieces. And this one here, it's a really controversial album. It's a double album consisting of only 4 songs, each song taking up a side, so it's about 20 minutes per song. And for that reason alone, it's considered one of the most pretentious albums of all time. And a lot of the progressive rock detractors really pinpoint this album here as being the album that really exemplifies how overblown and pretentious progressive rock was, and how, these musicians were so far up their own asses that they couldn't craft a good tune. And I completely disagree with that. It's no lie. I'm a huge progressive rock fan. It's probably one of my all-time favorite genres, right up there with heavy metal, hard rock, and jazz fusion as well, which actually brings me to the second reason why I decided to review this. Just currently getting into Bitches Brew by Miles Davis, which is an album with actually a similar structure to this one. And, it really draws you in with the cover art similar to Tales from Topographic Oceans. It's a double album. It has a lot of 20-minute tracks. And that album is universally praised as being a classic. So you know what? If jazz musicians could do that and get away with it and have their albums be considered all-time classics, why can't Yes do it? But yeah, I'm going to defend it. I'm going to give it an honest review. When there's a flaw, I will pinpoint it. But I'm going to give you guys my honest opinion on this classic album, because I really do think it is a classic, and not just for the album artwork. A lot of people just like this album for the classic Roger Dean cover, which is absolutely phenomenal. I prefer Relayer a bit more, but, we're splitting hairs here. This is probably the second best Yes album cover. But I also love the music within, although it is at times pretentious. So this album here, Tales from Topographic Oceans, I've had a long history with this album. A pretty early progressive rock experience for me. I think I was about 14 when I first started getting into it. And up to this point, I had been listening to all the Yes albums in order, starting with Close to the Edge and the Yes album. Those 2 I heard simultaneously in one day, changed my life forever. And then I was just slowly working my way through the album. And then one day, I was finally brave enough to check out Tales from Topographic Oceans. Now, I gotta be honest, guys, at the time, the whole side-long thing, double album, that really intrigued me as a 14-year-old. I thought that was absolutely epic, and I was extremely excited to get into it. Whereas, I think a lot of people kind of get daunted by that. I was all for it. The bigger the better. Now, over the years, my philosophy kind of changed, and I try to take quality over quantity. But as a hungry 14-year-old, that really appealed to me. So I dived right into the album, and kicking it off was The Revealing Science of God. Now, I'll never forget my reaction to this. I hate to say it, but I absolutely hated the first 2 minutes of the song. It opens up with this Gregorian chant. I thought that was so freaking annoying. But then once I got past that section, I love it now, by the way, but once I got past that section and the song evolved, I was blown away. It was just such a wonderful song. I absolutely loved it. And, you know, I was like, oh, this is going to be another masterpiece like Close to the Edge. Then I got into the remembering, and I'll never forget it. It was a snooze fest the first time I heard it. Didn't like that track at all. Then we got into the ancient, and it was so freaking weird. My 14-year-old mind could not process that shit. And I was getting really disheartened at this point because I'd only liked one of the three songs so far. And here we are about, what, like 60 minutes into the album at this point, and I wasn't liking it, to be honest. Then we got to Ritual, and I fucking loved it. So really, for a long time, I'd say for a year or so, I kind of just never listened to those two tracks in the middle. And those, to be fair, those seem to be the ones that a lot of people have issues with. And we'll get into why. And I would just really listen to the first song and the last song and kind of just tolerate that chant at the beginning of the first track. But then over the years, something kept me going back. And I'm like, you know what? There's more to this. There's more to this. And I kept trying and trying and trying. And I just couldn't get into those songs. Well, the remembering kind of grew on me, but I could never get into the ancient. And I don't recommend doing this. But I just kept fucking trying and trying and trying and trying. And really, if something's not grabbing you by like the fifth or, you know, at the 10th listen, I recommend just stop wasting your time or at least come back to it later. But I was determined. I was determined to like this album. And sure enough, I finally did. But it took years. I mean, I went on a long hiatus after, you know, that one crazy portion of my life when I kept listening to this over and over, trying to like it. Went on a nice, like, maybe 2-3 year hiatus. Went back to it after hearing having a few more musical experiences, having my mind broadened. And now, today, I can honestly say I enjoy this whole album from start to finish. You know, again, there's some flaws, which we'll get to, but it's an enjoyable experience from start to finish, and I really do think that this album here is a masterpiece. So yeah, that's my little story behind the album, guys. Probably my least favorite of that classic period of Yes, those classic 6 albums, or maybe on par with Going for the One. But there's so many treasures within this album, and I can't wait to go in depth because, you know, I got so much to say about this album. So hopefully you guys will stay tuned, and we'll start off getting into the history behind this album. Okay, guys, so I would definitely be hard-pressed to find an album where the history and the background and the events leading up to the making of the album had such an impact on its actual music than Tales from Topographic Oceans. And I really think it's worthwhile to spend quite a few minutes on the history behind this album for that reason alone, and also because it's fucking hilarious. I mean, so much of this album and the making of it inspired the movie Spinal Tap, which is just freaking hilarious. If you haven't seen that movie yet, then go out and watch it right now. It's one of the funniest rockumentaries of all time. So I guess we should start off the story after Close to the Edge, which was Yes's magnum opus released in 1972 and widely regarded to be one of the greatest progressive rock albums of all time, if not the greatest. It's my personal favorite, but it really is widely acclaimed to be a masterpiece, and it's not overrated whatsoever. I mean, that album right there is just a stone cold classic. And the thing was, it was the right album, and it came out at the right time, because around 1972, progressive rock was actually really popular, believe it or not. I mean, this album went to number 3 on the US charts, okay? That's the US charts, not even the UK charts where they came from. I don't even think Genesis achieved, you know, like chart success like that until way later, until their 80s period. So yes, we're definitely riding high on this wave of progressive rock being in the mainstream, which is just fucking awesome to think about. I can just imagine, you know, just your everyday average person listening to stuff like Thick as a Brick, which also went to number 1, just one long 40-minute track. It's just hilarious to think. I wish I was around back then, but that wasn't my fate, sadly. But anyway, guys, the point was, yes, we're doing fantastic at this point, and Close to the Edge was both a critical and commercial success. Now, I just want to mention, at this point, the lineup of the band consisted of John Anderson on vocals, Steve Howe on guitar, Bill Bruford on drums, Chris Squire on the bass, and Rick Wakeman on the keyboard. So really the classic lineup of Yes that I believe produced their best music, or, you know, along those lines. Fantastic lineup. And, you know, you would think that everything going well with the band at this point commercially, there wouldn't be many lineup changes. But guess again, guys, because there was a huge seismic shift about to happen. Bill Bruford, one of the all-time best progressive rock drummers. I mean, just extremely influential. One of the best jazz fusion style progressive rock drummers, in my opinion, right up there with Phil Collins. Yeah, he was fed up with Yes at this point. He came out of nowhere at the end of the Close to the Edge sessions, and just quit the band. He had been offered a nice, tasty proposition by Robert Fripp of King Crimson to join that band, and we all know what happened there with the classic trio of those fantastic mid-70s King Crimson albums. But it really wasn't as spur of the moment as you might think, because really Bill Bruford just did not like the way Yes was operating at this point. There were a lot of personality clashes in the band, and everything seemed to be like a democratic process where everyone had to weigh in. They could never really do anything spontaneously, and there were really literally arguments about everything. They had spent a long ass time in the studio making Close to the Edge, and all the arguments just drove Bill Bruford fucking insane, and he couldn't take it anymore. So he did not give a shit how successful the album would become. He wanted out, and plus he was more of a jazz drummer as well. He wanted to explore different things, and another amazing reason why he left the band was he thought Close to the Edge was literally the epitome of all he could do in Yes. He knew it was a masterpiece. He knew they wouldn't be able to top it. They came close, okay? The Relayer album came pretty damn close, but at the end of the day, he was right, and nothing bested the magnificence of Close to the Edge. So Bill Bruford left the band abruptly, right before the tour was scheduled to start, and the band were left scrambling. They're like, what the fuck are we going to do? And they really had no options at this point. But, okay, the producer Eddie Offord suggested Alan White join the band. And Alan White was a good friend of Eddie Offord. They'd shared a flat together in England. And funny enough, he was actually in the Plastic Ono band with John Lennon and obviously Yoko Ono, all those guys. So he was a pretty seasoned musician, And he actually filled in for Bill Bruford during one of their sessions for Close to the Edge, where Bill had to leave early or something, and he just filled in just for fun for a few tracks or so. But yeah, so they already kind of knew Alan White. He was up to the challenge, so he joined the band. Now, the problem was they only had a week before the tour, and Yes had a lot of complex music under their belt. Close to the Edge, but think about it. They had the Yes album, they had Fragile, they had a huge repertoire of music, and it was looking impossible for them. But Alan White stepped up to the fucking plate, and he learned those tracks in 3 days' time, which is freaking insane. So say what you want about Alan White, he isn't as great as Bill Bruford, but you got to give the man credit for fucking learning Yes's entire back catalog, or at least the songs they were going to play live, in 3 fucking days, which is insane, especially given the complexity of Bill Bruford's drumming on Close to the Edge, which is absolutely phenomenal. So the band were ready to go on tour. They toured Close to the Edge. There's a nice documentary of that. The sound quality's kind of shit, but it's still nice to see the band performing. And they released the classic live album, Yes Songs, which is fantastic as well. So definitely recommend you check that out. And so nearing the end of the tour, it was time to start, talking about making a new album. And John Anderson, he was heavily into, he's an eccentric guy. He was heavily into like mysticism and especially Hindu mysticism, which it seems like a lot of those people in the early 70s, late 60s were dabbling in. And he was reading this book called Autobiography of a Yogi with, funny enough, a lengthy footnote that mentioned these 4 sacred Hindu scripts. I think they were called the Shastras or something. And each of these scripts described like a certain aspect of life or a certain aspect of the universe. And fucking John Anderson, man, like he was reading this stuff, and although he didn't really understand what was going on, he didn't actually go out and read these 4 Shastras of the Hindu religion or whatever you want to call it. He was dead set on making a fucking concept album about these 4 Shastras or these 4 books. And he was really into the idea, and he had this grand concept that he was going to do a double album, or not a double album, but basically an album of 4 tracks, and each of those songs would basically describe one of those Shastras. So here John Anderson was with this grand, pretentious concept in mind, and he went to Steve Howe. They were pretty close back then, and he basically pitched his idea to Steve, and Steve loved it. He was also into that mysticism, and he was totally on board, and they were just ready to develop this thing. The only problem was there were 3 other guys in the band, Squire, White, and Rick Wakeman, that they had to convince. And it took quite a bit of convincing. The whole band wasn't really down at first to have a concept album like this, something they didn't really know anything about. And to be honest, John Anderson probably didn't know fuck all about these fucking Shastras. But they went with it. They thought, as long as the music's great, we'll be on board. So eventually, the band went into rehearsal, and they ended up developing 4 tracks, just as John Anderson envisioned. One was 8 minutes, the other 12, the third 15, and the final 19. So if you do the math here, that adds up to about 55 minutes, which is pushing it for a single album. Actually, back then, that would definitely be pushing it. I think most albums back then were no longer than 45 minutes. Somehow Genesis, I don't know how they did this, and not to get off on a tangent, but they were able to squeeze like 54, 53 minutes of music on Foxtrot and Selling England, which is definitely pushing the limits of an LP beyond its capacity. So Yes basically had enough music, quite enough music to fill up a single album, and the songs were tight, they were perfect, and they were really proud of their work, but not enough to fill a double album. So they were left at a crossroads here. Like, what do we do? Do we remove one of the songs? Ah, fuck. Then the whole concept of the album gets thrown apart. Do we shorten it? Ah, fuck. These songs are so great as they are. So what do they decide to do? They decide, okay, you know what? We can work on these tracks. We can expand them to fill out a double album, which, ranges from about like 75 to 90 minutes in length usually back then. And they thought it would be fine. But what they ended up doing was they went into the studio and just started improvising basically and creating these improv sections and kind of used it as padding in these long tracks to kind of like fill up the space. And Rick Wakeman was really against this idea. He was like a big classical music fan. He was really influenced by classical, so he loved having things nicely structured, really composed. And here the band was telling the poor guy to write these vast, expansive soundscapes to kind of fill out the transitions in these tracks. And Rick Wakeman just didn't really want to do that. So that was the first thing that left a bitter taste in his mouth. And he just, even Chris Squire at this point, he mentioned that, there are a lot of amazing moments on Tales from Topographic Oceans, but they're very spaced out. And that seems to be like the main issue people have with this album. Now, I agree to some extent. You do get a sense that some of the songs are, expanded just for expanding them's sake. But I don't think it's as big as a problem as a lot of people say it is. I mean, sure, on the song The Remembering, it's just a glaring issue on that track. But on the other songs, I don't think it's that bad, and we'll get into that in depth. But for now, let's talk about the history. So anyway, they weren't really too happy with what they had written, and now it was time to record it. So they went into the studio, and the thing is, John Anderson, he really wanted to get the atmosphere right. Okay, he wanted to record this album. Now get this. Outside in a tent in the middle of nowhere. Okay, so right when the band heard that he wanted to do that, they quickly shut him down, and they just, it's funny because apparently John Anderson never did drugs, but all these, all these stories and things that he said kind of disputes that a bit. But anyway, no, he's just a great guy, just a really eccentric dude. So I'm just kidding about that. But yeah, so basically he wanted to do that, but the rest of the band just like, John, we can't fucking record outside. You're a lunatic. So they made a compromise. They went into the studio in London. I believe it was called Morgan Studios. And what do? They bring in bales of hay, cardboard cutouts of fucking cows, all kinds of shit to create like a countryside, organic kind of atmosphere that John Anderson was looking for. And it was just freaking hilarious. I mean, this is the stuff that Spinal Tap was made of. And it's no wonder why people thought it was pretentious. And not only people, but people in the fucking band. At this point, Rick Wakeman was totally not on board with what was going on. And Black Sabbath were recording their classic album, Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath, in the room next door, or in the studio next door. So Rick Wakeman, he was always at the bar in the studio just drinking, shooting darts. And one day, Tony Iommi or Ozzy or whoever, it's like, hey, you're always just standing around drinking here. Why don't you come into the studio and we'll have some fun? So Rick Wakeman famously contributed a lot to the Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath album. And it just really goes to show his heart wasn't really with Yes at this point. And by the end of these recording sessions, he was just not happy, especially now that they had to go out on the road and promote this thing. So anyway, they released the album, and it did pretty well on the charts. I think it went to number 6 in the U.S., which is pretty good. And a funny story, this album almost was fucking destroyed. We almost didn't get it because one day John Anderson and Eddie Offord were loading the tapes, like the album's tapes, into the truck to get to mixing, and I think Eddie Offord had to do something, so he just put them on the top of the car for a few seconds. Then what do? They fucking get in the car, drive off, obviously forgetting about the master tapes, and they get thrown off to the side of the road. So they finally realize that. They retrace their steps. Apparently, according to Wikipedia, John Anderson had to stop an incoming bus. That is fucking unbelievable, to get these tapes, and they ended up getting them, thank God, or else all that stress and hard work would have been for nothing. And And yeah, so it's just honestly insane story after insane story. And before we get into the touring shenanigans, can't talk about Tales from Topographic Oceans without talking about the classic album artwork by Roger Dean, their longtime album collaborator. And this one here is just celebrated as one of his best pieces. It's just honestly a marvel to look at. It has this amazing atmosphere to it. You got the Mayan pyramids, the Inca lines, the fish just swimming through. It's just beautiful to look at, and one of the classic album covers from the 70s. So absolutely fantastic. Just a great package. And again, I mentioned that when I was younger, I would just stare at this album cover for hours just to absorb the music. So they released the album. It got okay reviews. A lot of people called it a little bit boring, which is understandable, and a little bit pretentious, which again is very understandable. But again, number 6 in the US, not too bad. So these guys had to get their asses out on tour, and they actually hired Roger Dean to design this elaborate set piece for them, like this elaborate stage design, which is actually pretty funny. And apparently, Alan White would be inside this kind of shell while he's drumming, and the shell would open and close periodically. And apparently one night it malfunctioned, and the guy was fucking trapped in there and shit like that. And, that definitely inspired that scene in Spinal Tap. Just fucking crazy shit like that. And they would play the whole album, talk about a band having faith in their material, playing an entire double album set, and apparently close to the edge as well. Fucking crazy. The most famous story of all, the curry incident. Rick Wakeman was on stage, and he was probably playing one of his long solos from the Remembering, and a roadie actually brought him curry on stage, and he's fucking eating this shit as he's playing this fucking solo. So that just goes to show how bored the guy was, and it's just a famous story. I always get a kick out of that. And needless to say, he just wasn't enjoying his time in Yes, and right after that concert, or right after that tour, he announced that he was leaving the band. And it didn't help that John Anderson was nagging him about the quality of his playing. And we're talking about Rick Wakeman here. The guy's a fucking virtuoso. And you get John Anderson, who didn't know fuck all about playing keyboards, nagging him about getting a solo right. It wasn't working out. So Rick Wakeman, the legend, left the band. Don't worry, he would come back many times. But yeah, another big seismic shift in Yes history after the Tales from Topographic Oceans tour. So just an insane album. Just so much shit went down in the making of it, and it really shows in the music. So without further ado, let's talk a little bit about the overall review of the album. Oh man, guys, what did I get myself into? This is going to be such a tough album to review. There's just so much going on in this album, and it's such an enigma. There's so many contrasting opinions that I want to get across. It might take a while, so strap on in, guys, because this is going to be Tales from Topographic Oceans. Now, the first thing I want to address is that this album here only has 4 tracks. It's a double album, each track coming in at 20 minutes, as I mentioned before. And that might sound just really daunting. And how does it feel? Does it feel like it's really an 80-minute long album? Do you get bored? Do you get listener's fatigue? Yes and no. I really think on the first listen, you can get a lot of listener's fatigue. Again, it is 80 minutes in length, and it can seem like the band is just really throwing a lot at you. But I think with repeated listens, you start to realize that, sure, these songs might be 20 minutes in length, but they're not throwing constant time changes at you. So it's really easy to absorb. They really let sections expand, and that might be a main criticism of it, but they let sections breathe and expand. You really can get lost in the music on this album. It's not like the album is incredibly demanding, constantly changing in tone and atmosphere. I mean, sure, there are a lot of time changes, but most of these tracks can really be whittled down to maybe 3 or 4 main themes. And sure, there's some padding between those main themes, but really when you boil it down to that, a 20-minute track having 4 themes isn't really a big deal. So it starts becoming more accessible the more you listen to it. And it really, at the end of the day, when I listen to this album now, it doesn't feel like 80 minutes. It goes by pretty fast because it has those memorable themes that come back to you and it just keep you engaged and listening to it. Now, here's the detriment to that. As I mentioned, there aren't a lot of time changes on the album, and most of the songs do rely on specific themes that really get drawn out. Now, that could be a problem because, again, I mentioned the band had to really expand these tracks to physically make them fit on a double vinyl. And I feel that there are just too many reprises of those themes at certain points, especially on the second song, The Remembering, where it feels like the song should really be progressing and moving forward into different territory. It just suddenly goes back to a theme that came earlier on on the song, and it just, I don't know, it feels like it's just there for the sake of being there. Now again, a lot of people make it seem like this is like a huge problem that goes across all the songs on the album. Sure, there is a lot of repetition on most of the tracks on the album, but I really think that this can be honed down to the one song, The Remembering. Here it's a glaring issue, guys. I mean, that song there could have easily been 10 minutes. And it does happen on a few other tracks, but I really think that one there is the main offender. And I definitely agree with that criticism on that track. But I think overall on this album, they do a good job of spacing out the themes and just not getting too repetitive. Now, another major thing about this album is it goes off into what the band calls padding sections. So these are basically those improv sections they threw in. And basically what they usually end up being are just Rick Wakeman, really expansive, spacey, symphonic synth sections. And again, I like them. When they come on the album, I really think they're beautiful. I think they're just a nice palate cleanser between, as I always call it, the meat and potatoes of the track, like the main substance. And usually they're done in good taste. But again, that second track, The Remembering, bam, it's a huge problem. It's way too repetitive. So again, a lot of people seem to think this album's overlong and boring and everything. And I could definitely see that for the second track. That's the point I want to make. Now, another main criticism I want to make about this album is the third track, The Ancient. This track here is a very inaccessible song. I mean, it is extremely experimental, and I could totally see why people wouldn't get into it. With many listens, I finally come to appreciate this track, and I actually love the song. I can honestly say, I'm not just saying that, I actually love the track, but it is the most avant-garde thing on the album. On an album that's actually very accessible, you know. If you take out like the long, expansive synth sections and narrow it down to like the main melodies, this album's actually pretty catchy, pretty accessible, and really beautiful at points. But that third track, the Ancient, it's a very jarring experience. Has some very avant-garde sections that might throw some people off. And even though the last like 6-7 minutes is just absolutely beautiful classical music, the first 13-12 minutes might throw people off. So it breaks up the action. And for the longest time, I just could not get across. I could not get past the first 12 minutes of The Ancient. But now I've come to appreciate. So now I just wanted to get those criticisms out of the way. Now let's talk about what I love about this album. Now, first of all, again, this goes back to what I said about the album being accessible. And this is just something about Yes in general, is that their melodies are fucking gold. I mean, they would make the Beatles proud. They have the strongest melodies, and they have the beautiful harmonization. John Anderson being one of my favorite singers of all time. The guy fucking sings like an angel. And I saw Yes with Rabin, Wakeman, and Anderson 2 years back, and he sounded just as great. You know, a little bit of hints of age to his voice, but for a 72-year-old man, it was absolutely phenomenal. But not only do you have his amazing voice, you have the beautiful harmonies that Chris Squire and Steve Howe and Alan White bring in to enhance John Anderson's voice. And there are a lot of harmonies on this album. Like, they make use of that shit to the absolute maximum. And there's very few sections where John Anderson is just singing without the harmonization. But he does at quite a few points. But compared to other albums, it's mostly harmonization. And that gives it this nice, accessible feel. So again, very accessible melodies and harmonies. So that's what I love about the album. So although it's marketed as this like impenetrable progressive rock album, it's just really memorable. The themes are awesome. The lyrics, I'm not going to delve into them. You know, John Anderson didn't even know what the fuck he was talking about. And when you listen to Yes, you don't really listen to it for the lyrics because usually they're incomprehensible gibberish. And I just got to give a shout out to a great YouTube channel, Just JP, where he reacts to these Yes songs and actually makes an attempt to analyze the lyrics. And I'm just sitting here thinking like, man, like just listen to the music. But he actually makes sense of that. So shout out to you, Just JP, great channel. Anyway, where was I? I'm going off on tangents. Oh yeah, what I love about the album. So that's the first thing. The second thing I love about the album is the star of the show here, Steve Howe. His guitar playing, let me tell you guys, it's absolutely spellbinding on this album. He goes through so many different styles, classical, just plain old rock at some points, but it's so fluid, it's so evocative, and the emotion he puts into his guitar is second to none. Like, honestly, this album here and the next one, Relay, are probably the two greatest Steve Howe guitar moments. And he's such an excellent player. And again, some really eccentric parts as well, where he's really going off into the stratosphere, and you're like, whoa, like, where's this going? But then he always brings it back with some awesome, accessible, melodic guitar lines. So absolutely amazing. The one thing, and another amazing thing about this album, it's absolutely gorgeous. It's absolutely stunning. A lot of the moments on this album literally make the hair on the back of my neck stand up. They're so beautiful, and they're so climactic and so majestic, and really just some of the best Yes music of all time is on this album, and you just gotta wait for it. But when it happens, when that climax kicks in, oh my god, it's so powerful. And sometimes, again, when a climax gets repeated throughout the song multiple times, it can, kind of defeat the purpose of that. Think about Close to the Edge. I mean, when that original theme comes back in at the end, it's so powerful. But again, that's the problem with Yes, with all these reprises on this album. When you're reprising a climax, like a really climactic theme, it takes a little bit away from that. Like, let the listener work towards that point. So that's the one criticism I would say regarding that. But in isolation, those climactic, euphoric moments are very abundant on this album, and absolutely gorgeous, absolutely beautiful. Amazing. Some of the best Yes music, especially the ending of the last song. Oh my god. One of their best moments. So much to love there. Another thing I want to touch on with this album in terms of its overall sound is that this album here is probably the least rockin' of all the Yes albums. Now, I'm not going to sit here and pretend that Yes were ever like a hard rock band, but on a lot of their albums before this, actually all of their albums, they always had those awesome grooves driven by Chris Squire's pulsating bass, and it was almost funky at points. But yeah, it always had that driving rhythm to it, that upbeat, up-tempo kind of groove to it, which was awesome. And this album here, it still has some of that, but much less than the previous albums. This one here is definitely symphonic in nature. And, I gotta say, Rick Wakeman, we gotta give this guy more credit, because again, he wasn't too happy with his performance on the album, but his synth and mellotron playing on this album are really what gives it that symphonic edge. I mean, this sounds like a fucking symphony, especially when he brings in the string section on his mellotron. It's just absolutely beautiful at some point. So Rick Wakeman's playing, although like he wasn't a big fan of it, we gotta give this guy credit for really laying the foundation of the symphonic sound of this album. So Rick Wakeman definitely, ironically, plays a huge role in the shaping of Tales from Topographic Oceans. And his style on this album is different as well. There's less organ, less of those funky rhythms, those up-tempo rhythms. It's really like spacey and expansive, and it gives it that beautiful sound. So I really like Rick Wakeman's playing on here. Could have used a little bit more of that organ flair that he did on Close to the Edge, but hey, can't really complain. So yeah, probably the most expansive sounding, the least rocking of all the Yes albums. So if you want to point one album as being their symphonic prog masterpiece, because that's what they're often classified as, then I would say this one is over Close to the Edge. But overall, again, Close to the Edge, can't beat that shit. Now, Alan White, let's talk about him a bit. His drumming is really good on this album. Not as intricate, not as jazzy as Bill Bruford, but his more laid-back, heavy-handed kind of feel definitely suits the more symphonic sound of this album. So great fit here. I don't know if Bill Bruford's style would really fit on this album very well. He would probably adapt, like it's fucking Bill Bruford, but I think Alan White does a good job here. And he wrote a lot of sections as well, so gotta give him those writing credits. And look at the guy now, he's been in the band ever since, so obviously an integral part of Yes. So yeah, guys, that was a lot. That was a long-ass review. But overall, this album has a lot going for it. Just to summarize, the melodies are so catchy. Steve Howe gives the guitar performance of a lifetime. It's symphonic, it's grand-sounding, and overall, it's beautiful. It's a freaking beautiful album. It really touches the soul at certain points. And although there's a few hit and miss sections here or there, overall, I think this definitely is a symphonic prog masterpiece. So, anyway, guys, now let's dive into the track-by-track reviews. Okay, guys, so the first track on the album, the revealing science of God, Dance of Dawn. For me, guys, this is my favorite track on the album. The last track comes pretty close, but this one here really has it all. It really does everything right. It has so many strong melodies. It doesn't really have too much padding. Everything just seems to fit right into place. And I fucking love the first 9 minutes of this track. It's just so beautiful, so melodic. And the last 12 minutes or so are really great as well. There's a lot of time changes, a lot of, not an excessive amount of time changes, but a lot more than the first 9 minutes of the track, which really is that main theme really, really played out. And it's just an incredible song. It's one of my favorite Yes songs. Would definitely be in my top 10. And coming in at, I think, 22 minutes, it's the longest track on the album. So that's a good sign when the best song is the longest. But, probably just by a minute or 2 minutes or so. But yeah, definitely an excellent song. Just going to run through the highlights of the track, because there's so many of them. And I love how everything just comes into place in the end, just really congeals. And it really all comes full circle. So let's start off with this intro I keep fucking talking about, this infamous intro. Now, first thing I want to say is that if you have the original pressing of the album really kickstarts with John Anderson singing this Gregorian chant. But if you have the remastered version, which is the one I have, they actually added in this nice atmospheric section, opening it up. It lasts about 2 minutes, which seems really long. But if you look at the grand scale of things, this thing's already a 21-minute long track. What's an extra 2 minutes at the beginning? And what this is just really sets up the ambience of the song. Really sounds like the primordial soup that the song kind of builds out from. Just some really sparse lines from Rick Wakeman's synth, creating this kind of swelling atmosphere. And it's really relaxing, really serene. And then all of a sudden, John Anderson comes in with the Gregorian chant part that I was talking about. And this part here is just a part of the album that I absolutely adore, I absolutely love. But for some reason, when I first heard it, I could not gel with this section of the song. It's basically this 2-minute buildup of John Anderson singing this chant. And it gets more and more intense as it goes along with every verse. The tempo increases, different instruments come in, like some really shrieking synthesizer in the background. And it just feels, to me these days, this feels like a really spiritual section of the song. And again, I'm not a spiritual person, but the authenticity of what they were trying to get across really comes through with this intro. And I feel that, although people consider it pretentious and everything, I think John Anderson just really believed in this idea, really believed in himself. And it's just a really awesome section of the song. It climaxes and gets really fucking intense, really weird at some points. But when it reaches a climax, we get these iconic synthesizer lines from Rick Wakeman, this grand scale kind of chord, and that ends up being like the main theme of the track, which gets repeated often throughout, especially at the ending. And Steve Howe comes in with one of my absolute favorite guitar moments right off the bat. We're like 3-4 minutes into the track with just this incredible flurry of notes, the iconic I can't even sing it, but it's just one of the most uplifting, joyous melodies I've ever heard on the guitar in my life. And they knew it too, because it's reprised quite a few times on the album. And on the last track, it makes a fantastic appearance right at the end. So really, the song then delves into what I consider the main theme of the track, which goes on for about 8-9 minutes. And it's just great. You got everything here. You got the beautiful harmonies, the symphonic keys in the background, and John Anderson just delivering a fantastic vocal performance. And overall, it's just a really nice, laid-back section of the song. And I love how they just let the song develop in that sense. They don't do all these crazy time changes. They knew that was a strong melody, and they really wanted to develop it and really let it envelop you as a listener. So awesome section of the song. And then at the 9-minute mark, things start to change. We get this heavy drum beat coming in, and this and the tide of the song turns from this relaxing, serene intro to this this really like frantic section. It doesn't last very long, but it definitely, it definitely took me off guard the first time I heard it. And yeah, really nice change of tempo. And I love how Steve Howe throws in a few of these rockin' guitar licks in the background. And Alan White's just heavy-handed drumming really suits this section. You still got the harmonies and everything, but there's this anxiety, there's this kind of drive to it that the intro of the song didn't really have. Now, it doesn't really last long, because then the song winds down to this relaxing section, and then we get this amazing spacey mellotron section. Again, something that a lot of people would criticize as being like the padding on the album, but I think it's absolutely beautiful. And I mean, the mellotron is just one of my all-time favorite instruments, and it just takes you back into that serenity that the middle section of the song really had there. And then it gets into the second main theme of the track. I call it the overhanging trees theme, and it's really powerful, really melancholic, just evoking images of, destroying the forests and, mankind really fucking up the earth. So I can understand some of the lyrics there. And the mellotron theme there is just, again, absolutely gorgeous. Can't say enough about the mellotron. Then we get a sudden transition where we get this piano section. And I swear to God, this sounds exactly like Heart of the Sunrise. And then we get the harmonies coming in. It gets a little bit, it kind of reprises that frantic section I was just talking about. Actually, it is an exact reprise of that. So again, that wasn't even 2 minutes ago, and we're already getting a reprise of it. Maybe you should have put that a bit later in the song, but again, I'm not going to argue with the structure. And here on out, the song gets really, really out there. The last 5 minutes of the track bring in a lot of themes from earlier in the song, and I'm not going to go through each one of them, but there's a few awesome highlights. There's this really awesome funky section, and again, I mentioned there aren't many funky sections in the track, but we get this funky groove on the guitar, and the playing is just so fluid, and it gets really triumphant, and then it winds down, gets some close to the edge, like reggae riffing going on there. It's just absolutely awesome. Then we get transition into this ominous melody. There's some flute lines, some sitar lines in the background. We get a reprise of that earlier beautiful mellotron section, a reprise of the overhanging trees section there, and a new section, the Christian soldiers, which I think I'm getting chronologically confused right now, but it's somewhere in there. And it's just this beautiful kind of laid back section thrown in there. So really awesome. And again, the synth solo by Rick Wakeman is really crazy here, really his virtuoso moment on the album, where he isn't just adding that beautiful symphonic edge. He's actually going all out. So gotta love that section there. And when that original riff comes in, not the original riff, that amazing lick I was telling you about, the closing out the track, and they get into the original theme of the track with the "What happened to this song?" blah blah blah. That's just a really powerful moment, because again, we haven't heard that theme since the beginning of the song, and they made you work to it. They made you wait for it. Whereas a lot of the other themes in the track were kind of repeated throughout that last 5-6 minute section. So I really like that. And then it ends off perfectly with the Gregorian chant again, just winding the song off. It really does come full circle. And yeah, it's just one of those classic Yes songs, a timeless masterpiece. So many strong themes running throughout this track. And I really don't think they could have really trimmed much off this one. So at 22 minutes, that's saying something. So the Revealing Science of God, I gotta give it a 10 out of 10. It's one of my all-time favorite progressive rock songs, and definitely for me the best track on the album. Alright guys, now we flip it over to side 2, The Remembering. This is the infamous song I keep talking about, where I really feel like this one could have had some major trimming done to it. And it's just a really repetitive song. And here's what kills me. The individual sections of the track, except for one of them, like the individual themes and melodies, are very strong. They're very good. And I think reworked into like a 10-12 minute time frame, this could actually have been one of the best songs on the album. But they just unnecessarily repeat themes. They put way too much instrumental synthesizer section padding on this track that just gives it this very sparse, very loose, all over the place kind of feel that doesn't really work as a whole. And it's a shame because, again, the melodies are extremely strong. So anyway, let's break this song down and talk about a bit of the highlights and a bit of where it stumbles a bit. So opening up the track, we get this really sleepy, really kind of I don't know, medieval sounding fluty intro. And I'm not a big fan of this section as well. This probably is the worst theme on the song, and thankfully this one isn't really repeated very much. But yeah, it features John Anderson kind of singing these droning mantra-like vocals, and it uses the lower register of his voice, which I'm not really used to. And I feel like it gives it this soulless, lifeless kind of feel. So I was never really a big fan of the intro of the song, and that lasts about 2.5 minutes. But then at 2.5 minutes, a really strong melody comes in, the one where he sings, "Ours, and search the forests of the sun. And I do think very well," that section right there. I think that's probably the highlight of the song, like the major theme. And it's beautiful, and you get these beautiful mellotrons swelling in the background. It's just a great section. I love that there. And then at the 4-minute mark, we dive into the first of many of Rick Wakeman's synthesizer symphonic landscapes, and it actually works pretty well here. And then, again, when you want the song to progress, it goes right back into that original section with the sleepy drone-like mantra, and I feel like that would have been a perfect opportunity to let the song really explode and expand, but they go back to the original theme. So that's example number 1 of padding right there. Then we get into the second theme of the track, which is pretty good, pretty triumphant. The "stand on hills of long forgotten yesterday." That part there, it's just really joyous, really upbeat. You get like the fluty synthesizer in the background. And it's like a nice climax. So really that would have been a great way to end off the track with a climactic thing. And so that's the second theme of the track. Again, very strong. Then at around the 7-minute, 30-second mark, we get an absolutely beautiful Rick Wakeman synth section. I mean, this section here is one of the strongest Rick Wakeman synthesizer melodies on the entire album. It's just absolutely cosmic. Like, you listen to this, it feels like you're floating off into a different galaxy. And it's absolutely gorgeous. And if it was just repeated once throughout the entire song, that would be perfect. But it's repeated 4 times. So although, again, it's such a beautiful, such a strong melody, you don't really need it to be repeated that much. And it just really teaches you a lesson that sometimes you're listening to a song and you get into a section that you love, but then the song goes off into something else. And you're like, crap, I wish that section was repeated more. This is a prime example of how that actually acts as a detriment to the overall song when it's just way too repetitive. But anyway, that synthesizer melody at 7:30, it's beautiful. And John Anderson even quoted it as his favorite Rick Wakeman moment, I believe. And, I can't really disagree. It's just awesome. Then we get into the third theme of the track, the upbeat, groovy section, which is really cool. Because, again, I mentioned that this song and this album in particular doesn't have any of those really groovy moments driven by Chris Squire's bass. This is an exception here, and it's really poppy, really catchy. And this is the relayer section. It's a nice change of pace. Then we get into another sparse synth section, and immediately after that, we get back into the relayer theme. So I feel like, why break that theme up with a sparse synth section? We already got that earlier in the track. Just have the relayer theme play and then go on to something else. Don't just break it up with a random synth section. Oh man, you guys can see what I'm talking about. And then here's what kills me. At the 14-minute, 40-second mark, we get a reprise of the "Stand on hills of long forgotten yesterday." And again, that theme being so triumphant, you feel like that's going to be the climax of the song. It would have been a perfect opportunity to wrap things up, but that's not what happens. Instead, we get that sparse synth section again for like the 4th time, and we get a little bit of Steve Howe soloing here. Not bad, but it's just, again, at this point, it's wearing thin on you. Then the song finally ends with the theme from the beginning, the theme I love a lot, where it says, "The ours we stand." Sorry to be singing every section, but I can't describe it otherwise. And this, okay, I'm like, okay, this is a pretty good way to end the track. And we're 18 minutes in, and for some reason we get the lick, that epic lick I was talking about from the Revealing Science of God coming back in, which is pretty cool. It gives the album a cohesive feel, but overall, it's just 20 minutes is not what this song should have been. It should have been like 12, 13 minutes for the amount of content within. And it's a shame, because for that reason, I'm going to give the song an 8.5 out of 10. And it could have been like a 9.5 or a 10 out of 10, because the moments in this track are absolutely gorgeous. It's just way too repetitive. And I feel like even 8.5 is being a bit generous. But, man, I got to take those strong sections into account. So that's the score I'm sticking with. So that's side 2, the remembering. Now we're going to put on the second record. then we get to side 3 of the album, The Ancient, in brackets, Giants Under the Sun. And this track here seems to be like a major stumbling block with many people, myself included, because it's very out there, it's very avant-garde, and it really does demand many, many listens to really get into. Again, I don't suggest just sitting there and like trying extremely hard to get into this. I would say like come back to it at different points in your life, and hopefully, just like me, at some certain points in your life, this song will definitely reveal itself to you. And hopefully that happens. But don't try too hard. Just enjoy it. It's music, guys. But The Ancient, this one here is definitely the most unique song on the album. It's definitely the least accessible, as I've mentioned millions of times already. And it goes through the most changes out of all the tracks. Really has a lot of different themes that the song develops. And a lot of really improv-style sections that really build an intensity. As well as the final 6 minutes of this song is just a thing of sheer beauty with the classical guitar. And it's just such an enigmatic song. It's so weird. Nothing, Yes would never do a song before like this, before or after. And it's just really unique. And that's what I love about it. Coming after like the sparse, laid back remembering, this is the track we really needed. And it took me a while to really realize that until, again, a few years back when this song finally hit me. So, first of all, let's talk about the track. Let's go through all the highlights like I'm doing with all these other songs. It's hard because, again, these tracks are so long. And, although this one's the shortest, coming in at 18 and a half minutes, there's just so much packed into it. So, really a lot going on here. The first thing you'll notice is that it starts off with this ominous intro. It starts off with this cymbal crashing, and it sounds really primordial, really primitive. And then we get into this crazy percussion groove, and I think it's driven by Alan White's tribal style drumming, which really fits the whole theme of the song, talking about all these ancient civilizations. And Chris Squire's pulsating bass in the background. So we have this crazy groove kind of acting as the bedrock of the track. And then Steve Howe comes in with this really strange, really weird lap steel guitar solo, and it's just extremely dissonant. It really clashes with the underlying groove laid down by White and Squire, and it's just really evocative. It just really goes all over the place, feels really free form, and really atonal, so that could really drive a lot of people off at first, and it does last 3 minutes, so it is pretty lengthy, and there are some bits and pieces there where it feels like something melodic is about to spring forth, but then before you know it, it gets right back into the madness. And it just really does feel like a primordial soup, like early civilizations of savages and things like that, just living out in the wild without any food or shelter, just really primitive, things like that. So awesome section, and again, when you think about it in terms of the theme of the track, it really does work. So if it's not growing on you, just be patient. It might sink in one day. But then at the end of that crazy atonal section, we get this beautiful mellotron coming in, and it's a really powerful moment, especially after all that tension that intro built up. You really need this beautiful cosmic mellotron section provided by Rick Wakeman. Again, he brings so much of the beauty onto this album, and this is a prime example. Then I think at around the 4-minute and 20-second mark, what I would consider the main theme of the track comes in, and it's absolutely great. I mean, again, Rick Wakeman using the string section sound on his mellotron, giving it this really orchestral, symphonic sound, and it's really uplifting, really upbeat. It feels like the song's really picking up into something really melodic. And yeah, it actually does. This part of the song's actually pretty melodic. The vocals are pretty nice as well, but there's always a little bit of tension coming back, and right after a certain mellotron section, we'd get Steve Howe coming in with this weird atonal guitar lick. He even reprises Siberian Control of all things from Close to the Edge, just throws in a little lick of the main riff of that track, that took me off guard the first time I heard it. I'm like, holy shit, they're reprising like earlier albums on this, and it's not the last time either. Later on, they would reprise Close to the Edge on a different track, but we'll get into that later. But yeah, the song always keeps that original tension, although it is resolved and broken up by Rick Wakeman's beautiful synthesizer. We do get those crazy sections every now and then we get into a part of the song where John Anderson is just singing the word sun in different ancient languages, and it's great. Steve Howe's playing on this section of the song is absolutely melancholic, and it's just so fluid, and I can't describe it. It's playing on this album is just fucking incredible. And that's just a really strong section of the track there. It lasts up until like the 8-minute mark, so that's really the meat and potatoes of the first part of the song. Definitely more accessible than the first 3 minutes. But then at the 8-minute and 25-second mark, we go right back into the craziness, guys. because the band whip out one of the loosest, most intense jams of their entire career, and it lasts a good 4 or 5 minutes. So strap in, guys, and get ready, because this section of the song might be a little bit inaccessible as well, and it's really driven by Steve Howe's absolutely intense playing. I love how the tension just builds and builds and builds, and he even reprises the remembering, a main theme of the remembering in this section. So again, a lot of pieces in the puzzle just really fitting together on this section of the track. And I love Alan White's just, again, I keep using this word, but his heavy-handed, almost tribal-sounding drumming, and Chris Squire's weird bass lines in the background. It even gets a bit funky at some points. And again, with Chris Squire and Alan White acting as the bedrock, and Steve Howe just soloing over that. And it never really gels. It always feels kind of dissonant and atonal. But again, the intensity just mounts and mounts and mounts, and it's just absolutely crazy. It feels like you're descending into hell at one point, descending into the madness. And I love it. I think it's a great way to build tension. It really, spices up the song. But you might think, on first listen, that it's just noisy and everything. This is definitely one of those free-form sections that Rick Wakeman just wasn't a big fan of on the album. And yeah, I could totally see his opinion. It's just a matter of preference. But then let me tell you guys, the song totally changes at around the 12-minute, 20-second mark. Right when you least expect it, the song evolves into this beautiful, classical-inspired guitar work by Steve Howe, and it starts off with some vocal harmonization from John Anderson, but really the showcase part of the second half of the song here, or the second, whatever, like the last 7-8 minutes of the track, is Steve Howe's absolutely fantastic and memorable classical acoustic guitar playing. I mean, when was the last time you were able to say that a classical acoustic guitar piece was this memorable, this melodic, this catchy? And it's just absolutely fantastic. Probably one of the greatest Steve Howe guitar moments, in my opinion. One of the strongest melodies. And I just love how many different emotions that he can evoke with his classical guitar. Definitely one of the most underrated classical guitar players of all time. Beautiful. And he already kind of dominated the entire track. But this section here, although it's more laid back, more of an ambient kind of section, it steals the show every single time. And it does evolve into a pop melody. The Leaves of Green section, as people like to call it. And when they would play The Ancient live in later tours, they would always just kind of excise the first 13 minutes of the track and just play this section. And you could totally see why. It's just so accessible, so folky and poppy. And I just love it. It's such a feel-good song. But again, when Steve Howe gets into that classical playing section, I am absolutely off in another world. It's ethereal. It's phenomenal. And it's honestly a 10 out of 10. It's a 10 out of 10 section of the track. So beautiful. I like how the song just wraps up at the end with a reprise of the intro, just briefly, like 20 seconds, and just really holds everything together. So ironically speaking, a song that, I could never get into at first ended up having some of the strongest sections on the entire album. Again, it's kind of like a love it or hate it kind of track. Right now, I'm absolutely loving it, and I'm going to give it a 9.5 out of 10, because I think it's absolutely wonderful, and a great change of pace on the album. Nous sommes de Soleil. Closing out this wonderful album, guys, we get a song that I don't think any Yes fan would deny is an absolute classic, one of their absolute best songs, Ritual, in parentheses, Nous Sommes du Soleil. That's right, they're breaking out the French on this track. And this song here is it's an incredible piece of work. I mean, coming in at almost 22 minutes, it's almost as long as The Revealing Science of God. I think it's just short by about 30, 40 seconds, something like that. But it's definitely just as great. And earlier on, I mentioned that The Revealing Science of God is my favorite track on the album. But, I wouldn't really say that with confidence, because whenever I listen to Ritual, I think, fuck, maybe this is my favorite track on the album. And the same thing for Revealing Science. So really, I can't really decide between the two. Sometimes I lean toward one over the other, and vice versa. So really, let's just call it a draw. They're both incredible songs. And on Ritual, I mean, the whole band is just on fire on this song. Again, Steve Howe, goes without saying, he's really been on fire this entire fucking time since the beginning. But what really stands out for me on this track throughout the majority of its runtime is Chris Squire's bass playing. This song here is really a Chris Squire bass showcase, and honestly, his bass lines are so freaking melodic. I can't think of another rock bass player that can really evoke so much emotion with just using the bass. I can think of a few jazz ones like Jaco Pastorius, but Chris Squire's playing on this song is absolutely wonderful. And he's been on the album so far, obviously. He's had some good moments, but we never really had those standout Chris Squire moments. And, this is the song that really does that. And live, it's actually the only song they would really continue to play live on a consistent basis. And you guys got to watch the symphonic version. They got a fucking orchestra to come in. I think it's from 2000 or 2003, something like that. Anyway, it's on YouTube. It's a 30-minute orchestrated version of this track. And Chris Squire's bass playing on that, he even develops it into a full-on bass solo. It's just absolutely crazy. Just one of the best live tracks I've ever seen in my life. So check it out. But anyway, what makes this song tick? There's just so many highlights here. Again, it starts off with Chris Squire's extremely melodic bass lines and Alan White's percussive explosions opening up the track. Absolutely wonderful opening. And then Steve Howe comes in with this iconic guitar melody, one of the best on the album. The it's just honestly, it's stunning and haunting at the same time. And then we get the symphonic strings from Rick Wakeman coming in, like on a lot of the other tracks on the album. And the euphoric guitar line comes back. This time it's a little bit more powerful, and everything is just swelling and building up. And it's just a wonderful, relaxing, yet epic moment on the album. Then we get this 2-minute section of basically just John Anderson's scat singing, and Chris Squire picks up the bass lines in the background, and it's a really nice upbeat tempo. And we got John Anderson singing na 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 na. It's just a really joyous, sunny, bright section of the track, and really catchy as well. My only issue with it is that I think it goes on a bit too long at 2 minutes. I feel like that should have been cut back to about 1 minute and then let the song develop as it ends up doing. 2 minutes is a little bit overwhelming for me, but it brings the poppy hooks to the album, so I can't really fault it too much. Now we get another epic Chris Squire bass moment with these stop and start vocals, and this is a big moment for Chris. He's just fluttering all over that bass, and it's just a huge moment right there. And then I think we're about 4 minutes into the track now, and everything just kind of winds down, and Chris Squire takes the lead again. He's reprising all kinds of things here. He reprises the main lick of Revealing Science of God. He reprises a part of Close to the Edge on the guitar. And it's just this really... And Chris Squire's bass is absolutely... It's in the background. It's holding it down. But it's just fluttering, and it feels so light and airy compared to the bass playing we had just heard from Chris. So it just goes to show how much of a diverse player he is. And so Steve Howe really takes over this part. It's really violin-esque sounding, and a really magical sound coming out of his guitar, really mournful and beautiful. Again, this whole track's just been so joyous, so beautiful up till this point. And I really consider that the overture. And we're fucking almost 6 minutes into the song when the main melody of the Nous, Sommes, du Soleil comes in, and it's just another beautiful melody from Steve Howe. You just melt away at this section. And then we finally get John Anderson's main vocals coming into the song. Again, very harmonized, but less harmonized than the scat singing section at the beginning. And it's absolutely beautiful. It's anthemic, and he sings it with so much conviction. And it's just wonderful. Really, I love the lyric, Nous sommes du soleil. It means we are of the sun. And that's just a perfect way to describe what you feel when you're hearing this track. During this part, I also love Steve Howe's sitar-like guitar playing style. Really evokes those Indian themes that I guess the album was drawing from. And it gets really climactic when John Anderson sings, "Fight!" That's just a really powerful moment there. And it's great. They really play this part out, and I don't feel like it's overlong at all. It's just so epic and so anthemic that I can listen to another 2-3 minutes of this. But then all of a sudden, we get a reprise of Chris Squire's melodic bass lines that open the track, and for the next 3-4 minutes you're in bass heaven. I mean, Chris Squire gets into these awesome pumping bass grooves. Starts off really slow melodic, but then builds and builds and builds, and it gets pretty furious. And then Steve Howe's guitar playing comes in, and it gets a little bit unsettling, a little bit tense at the end. And again, these guys were masters of building that tension. And then when you least expect it, the song just totally changes at the most ominous section of that guitar part. And in comes, at the 14-20 second mark, a jarring, absolutely jarring change in this track. Alan White comes in with this crazy percussion section. And this section here used to fucking kill me. I used to love the track up till this point, but I couldn't get into the crazy Alan White percussion. And with Rick Wakeman's dark mellotron sound, again, a really ominous sounding mellotron, kind of like the Devil's Triangle by King Crimson, if you guys know that track. It was just a really ominous, a really weird section of the track, and I thought it was such a jarring transition that I thought it was just filler. But over the years, I've come to really appreciate this section. I still think the transition's kind of jarring, but once you get into that drumming, that heavy-handed percussion, the bells, the fucking actual drumming by Alan White, it's a great moment on the album. The tension builds fantastically. And then when it finally ends, when the tension mounts to unbearable levels, we get this kind of horn-sounding thing coming from Rick Wakeman's mellotron, and Steve Howe comes back in with this absolutely melodic guitar line, and it's just, the tension is released. It's honestly, this part here wouldn't be as powerful without that crazy percussion section building up that fucking pent up tension in this track. And it's just a gorgeous kind of resolution to that. Honestly, one of the best fucking moments. Get goosebumps every time. And then John Anderson comes in singing one of the all-time beautiful, basically reprising the Nous, Sommes, du Soleil section of the track, but way more laid back. And Rick Wakeman is just playing a simple piano in the background. And just thinking about it gives me goosebumps. It's one of those beautiful moments in Yes history. And they let it play out for about 2-3 minutes. And you're in absolute fucking heaven. Absolute heaven, guys. Then before you know it, the best part of the whole album, probably the best moment in Yes's entire discography. It's debatable, but for me, this is probably the one. At the 20-minute mark, we get one of the greatest Steve Howe guitar solos of all time that just builds and builds and builds and reprises the main lick of The Revealing Science of God for the millionth time on the album. But at this point, it just feels so triumphant, so powerful. And honestly, with this guitar solo, it just crescendos time after time. And right when you think it builds up to a climax, it just gets even more climactic. And honestly, guys, just thinking about it, like, this is probably one of the greatest moments in progressive rock history. It's hard to think of a better moment for me. Honestly, the ending of Close to the Edge comes close, and a lot of Genesis songs, a lot of King Crimson songs, but this is one of those crowning achievements in prog. And it just ends the album, and I really think that 2-minute guitar solo there just makes the album worth the price of admission alone. It's that fucking good. So that's the track. It's just a glorious song. Really showcases Chris Squire's bass playing, Steve Howe as always throughout the whole album, and some beautiful, beautiful melodies, guys. So I would give this track here easily a 10 out of 10. So that's right. This track and Revealing Science of God both got 10s. The Ancient got a 9.5, and Remembering got an 8.5. So if you average it out, this album's definitely a masterpiece. Definitely one I'd recommend that you dive into, and just, it's so easy to get lost into it. Sure, I did criticize it a bit here and there, but as a whole, I really think that this album here is a masterpiece. And I think with repeated listens and, coming back to it over the years, you're really going to love it, guys. So don't give up, especially if you like Close to the Edge and Relayer. I think that this album has a lot of potential for you guys, especially if you like more of the beautiful melodic side of Yes, with a little bit of craziness thrown in here or there on track 3. So anyway, guys, I think that's all I'm going to be saying about this wonderful album. Thank you so much for watching. And stay tuned for more videos coming your way, guys. I'm planning on doing a lot more Yes album reviews, seeing as they're one of my all-time favorite bands. And I don't know which one I'm going to do next. Maybe Relayer. We'll see what happens. But anyway, guys, thanks for watching again, and peace out.